es gibt sehr viel zu tun.
America is back.
Ja, guten Tag aus dem ARD-Hauptstadtstudio am Ende einer ereignisreichen Woche für die deutsche Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik. EU-Gipfel, Libyen-Konferenz in Berlin, US-Außenminister Blinken zu Gast. Noch ist Angela Merkel verantwortlich für Deutschlands Rolle in der Welt. Doch unsere 3 Gesprächsgäste heute wollen ihre Nachfolge antreten. Herzlich willkommen, Annalena Baerbock, Armin Laschet und Olaf Scholz. Und was sie fortsetzen oder aber auch verändern wollen, das wollen wir hoffentlich sehr konkret in den kommenden 90 Minuten erfahren. Und dazu an meiner Seite Wolfgang Ischinger, Leiter der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz.
Vielen Dank, liebe Tina Hassel. Auch ich begrüße Sie, die Kanzlerkandidatinnen der Grünen, der Union und der SPD, ganz herzlich. Und Sie vor allem, die Zuschauer zu Hause, zu dieser Debatte der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz. Im vergangenen Jahr haben wir bei der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz festgestellt, Deutschland befindet sich mitten in einer Zeitenwende. Diese Bundestagswahl wird also entscheidend dafür sein, wie Deutschland sich auf eine sich verändernde, rapide verändernde weltpolitische Lage einstellen wird. Ich freue mich sehr darauf, diese Fragen heute mit Ihnen im Einzelnen diskutieren zu können.
Ja, und dann fangen wir direkt an mit einer kurzen Frage und die Bitte nach einer kurzen Antwort an Sie 3. Angenommen, Sie wären jetzt Kanzlerin oder Kanzler, wo würde denn Ihre erste Auslandsreise hingehen und warum, Herr Laschet?
Das ist ja immer ein besonderer Akt. Wohin geht die erste? Und das würde ich erst dann machen, wenn es soweit ist.
Verraten Sie uns heute noch.
Man kann das erahnen, aber ich mache es erst dann, wenn es soweit ist.
Frau Baerbock, helfen Sie uns da konkreter schon weiter?
Nach Brüssel, weil deutsche Außenpolitik muss immer eine europäische sein. Und Amerika hat gesagt, America is back. Und daraus braucht es eine europäische Antwort und daher nach Brüssel.
Herr Scholz, wo geht Ihr Flieger hin?
Nach Paris. Die deutsch-französische Zusammenarbeit ist zentral dafür, dass wir es schaffen, Europa voranzubringen und europäische Souveränität zu erlangen. Und das ist, glaube ich, auch eine gute Tradition.
Das war jetzt die kurze Eingangsfrage. Jetzt gucken wir unseren ersten großen Block und da wollen wir auf die transatlantische Partnerschaft schauen. Präsident Biden war zur Charmoffensive in Europa und auch von Außenminister Blinken gab es in Berlin viele warme Worte. Der Westen ist zurück, aber für wie lange? Insofern an Sie die Frage. Wir haben ein kurzes Zeitfenster, das möglicherweise bleibt. Was müsste passieren am allerdringendsten, ich fange jetzt mal mit Ihnen an, Herr Scholz, um diese Zeit zu nutzen und den Westen stark zu machen?
Die wichtige Botschaft, die Präsident Biden aussendet, ist ja, dass er verstanden hat, dass es so etwas gibt im Westen, was uns verbindet als Demokratien. Und dass das auch etwas ist, was uns einer Welt, die sich komplett ändern wird, weiter verbinden wird. Das müssen wir möglichst stark machen als Gelegenheitsfenster für die nächste Zeit. Und deshalb bin ich fest davon überzeugt, dass, wenn wir auf die Welt schauen, die China, Russland, viele andere aufsteigende Nationen Asiens und noch manche andere kennen wird in den nächsten Jahrzehnten, es dabei zentral bleibt, dass wir so zusammenhalten und auf der Demokratie bestehen, auch als transatlantisches Bündnis. Und das ist die erste, wichtigste Aufgabe, das stark zu machen.
Darf ich noch bei Ihnen nachhaken, Herr Laschet? Also 2024 könnte ja sein, dass in Washington ein Donald Trump oder ein ähnlicher Politiker wie Donald Trump gewählt werden könnte. Aus unserer Sicht nicht gerade eine glückliche Perspektive. Was genau würden Sie als Bundeskanzler glauben, tun zu können, tun zu müssen, um genau das zu verhindern?
Also ich glaube nicht, dass ein deutscher Bundeskanzler verhindern kann, wie die Wählerinnen und Wähler in den Vereinigten Staaten stimmen. Aber ein deutscher Bundeskanzler kann nach seiner Wahl, wie Frau Hassel es gesagt hat, dieses Zeitfenster nutzen, jetzt so viel Gemeinsamkeit auch über den Atlantik hinweg zu nutzen, gemeinsam zu bewegen. dass damit vielleicht auch ein Präsident Erfolg hat und wir selbst auch Erfolg haben. Und das Gleiche gilt ja für Frankreich. Wir haben im Mai Wahlen in Frankreich. Und auch hier ist es wichtig, dass auch in Europa sich etwas bewegt und Deutschland und Frankreich auch eine neue Dynamik entfaltet, die dann immer Wechselwirkungen hat in die jeweiligen Länder, insbesondere da, wo Populisten versuchen, diese multilaterale Ordnung zu stören und zurückzukehren zum Prinzip mein Land first. Das ist nicht die Antwort jetzt und das kann man, glaube ich, auch als deutscher Bundeskanzler sehr stark mitprägen.
Dann stelle ich die Frage aber auch gleich an Frau Baerbock. Können wir was tun und wenn ja, was, um in Amerika den Eindruck zu verstärken, dass Europa, dass wir für Amerika, wie man auf Neudeutsch sagt, ein Asset sind, also etwas Positives und nicht Ballast, für den man ständig mehr zahlen muss, als man als Farmer in Idaho gerne zahlen möchte. Was tun wir, um in Amerika die Bereitschaft, Europa weiter zu umarmen, zu unterstützen, aufrechtzuerhalten und nicht in eine zweite Ära Trump zu verfallen?
Wir können sehr viel tun und das bedeutet, eine aktive europäische Außenpolitik zu betreiben. Das haben die Amerikaner, das hat die neue US-Administration ja eigentlich auch eingefordert, indem sie gesagt hat, America is back und jetzt müsste es eine europäische Antwort darauf geben, weil der ehemalige Präsident Trump hat ja versucht, deutlich zu machen, globale Kooperation, Multilateralismus, das funktioniert alles nicht, unter dem Motto America First. Und jetzt macht Biden deutlich zu sagen, nein, globale Zusammenarbeit, das ist unsere Stärke. Und das funktioniert natürlich nur, wenn der andere große liberale demokratische Akteur, die Europäische Union, das jetzt mit unterstützt. Und es gab am Anfang der 90er Jahre, hatte damals ja schon die US-Administration Deutschland gesagt, ein Partnership in Leadership zwischen den demokratischen Akteuren. Das war damals für die Bundesrepublik viel, viel zu früh. Aber jetzt ist aus meiner Sicht genau der Moment, wo eine deutsche Außenpolitik, aber eingebettet in eine europäische Außenpolitik, weil wie gesagt, deutsche Außenpolitik kann nur europäisch sein, diese Partnership in Leadership zwischen den USA und den Europäern wirklich angegangen werden kann bei den großen Herausforderungen unserer Welt. Und das ist der Wettstreit der Systeme zwischen autoritären Regimen und liberalen Demokratien und der Bekämpfung der Klimakrise.
Eine Besonderheit unserer Sendung ist, dass prominente Stimmen aus dem Ausland Fragen an Sie oder Forderungen an Sie stellen. Denn das sind nicht nur Herr Ischinger und ich, die das tun. Und wir fangen damit jetzt mal direkt an. Denn was können wir, Präsident Biden, denn überhaupt konkret anbieten? Und sind wir dazu in der Lage, mehr Lasten zu übernehmen? Denn das heißt ja Burden Sharing. Hierzu eine Frage des früheren US-Generals David Petraeus.
Ich würde gerne eine Frage zu Deutschlands militärischer Einsatzbereitschaft stellen, verbunden mit der Anmerkung, dass ich das Privileg hatte, von 2010 bis 2011 in Afghanistan deutsche Einheiten unter meinem Kommando zu haben, wo sie sehr beeindruckende Operationen durchführten. In letzter Zeit haben sich Berichte über die Bundeswehr allerdings oft auf ihre mangelnde Einsatzbereitschaft konzentriert. Auch ein Bericht des Bundestages von 2018 kritisiert die deutsche Gefechtsbereitschaft scharf. Zwar sind die Verteidigungsausgaben seitdem gestiegen, jedoch existieren weiterhin erhebliche Lücken. Welche Vorschläge haben Sie in Anbetracht dieser Umstände, um sicherzustellen, dass Mitglieder der deutschen Bundeswehr die für dauerhafte militärische Einsatzbereitschaft notwendige Finanzierung, Ausbildung, Personal und Ausstattung zur Verfügung haben? Danke.
Darf ich mal mit Ihnen anfangen, Herr Scholz, wenn Sie sich diese Frage anhören? Der Begriff der Lastenteilung, der beschäftigt uns, also die Bundesregierung und ihre Vorgängerregierung jetzt seit etwa 40 Jahren oder mehr. Wären Sie der Meinung, würden Sie meine Meinung teilen, dass eigentlich der Zeitpunkt gekommen ist, statt Lastenteilung eher von Lastenübernahme zu sprechen? Müssen wir nicht ein größeres Stück aus dem Kuchen der gemeinsamen Aufgaben übernehmen, um genau das zu tun, was Frau Baerbock gerade gesagt hat, dass wir aus amerikanischer Sicht nicht als Belastung, sondern als wichtiger Partner erscheinen?
Zunächst mal ist es so, dass Deutschland ja sehr viele Auslandsmissionen verfolgt. Der Deutsche Bundestag hat mehrfach darüber abgestimmt und jedenfalls mit den Stimmen unserer beiden Parteien diese Einsätze auch jeweils möglich gemacht. Und das, glaube ich, wird auch für die Zukunft eine große Aufgabe sein, dass wir dazu bereit sind und dass wir dann umgekehrt natürlich gucken, dass wir die notwendigen Fähigkeiten haben. Ich glaube, dass es eine schlechte Zeit war für die Bundeswehr, dass mit dem Beginn der schwarz-gelben Regierungskoalition so etwas wie eine Sparzeit begonnen hat und gerade der Rüstungshaushalt als Spardose für die öffentlichen Finanzen benutzt worden ist. Das hat sich aber geändert, gerade in der Zeit, in der ich jetzt Bundesminister der Finanzen gewesen bin, ist es so gewesen, dass wir eine erhebliche milliardenschwere Steigerung des Bundesverteidigungshaushaltes auf jetzt über 50 Milliarden Euro zustande gebracht haben. Allerdings sind wir dabei immer realistisch geblieben und das gehört auch dazu, dass man realistisch bleibt. Wir haben das jeweils möglich gemacht und in der längeren Perspektive muss man sehen, was die wirtschaftliche Entwicklung uns ermöglicht. Wir können ja auch nicht das Geld irgendwie drucken, das man dazu braucht. Und deshalb ist diese gewaltige Steigerung der letzten Jahre die Grundlage, auf der man aufbauen muss und die darf auch nicht in Frage gestellt werden.
Geld ist das eine. Ich spiele den Ball jetzt mal zu Ihnen rüber, Herr Laschet. Das andere ist aber, dass eben die Ausrüstung in der Tat immer noch nicht da ist, dass die Bundeswehr eben noch nicht wirklich genug ausgerüstet ist. Deshalb an Sie, was würden Sie General Petraeus antworten? Wie würden Sie als Kanzler sicherstellen, dass die Bundeswehr auch für ihre Aufgaben, die ja eher mehr als weniger werden, gerüstet ist?
Also das Erste, was bei diesen Diskussionen oft auffällt, ist, dass man die so auch in die Frage hinein schon anlegt, Deutschland müsste jetzt mal einen Beitrag leisten. Und da ist meine Antwort, Deutschland leistet ja schon seit vielen Jahren seinen Beitrag. Afghanistan ist erwähnt worden. Gerade erst haben deutsche Soldaten in Mali auch Verletzungen erlitten bei einem Anschlag. Und es gibt viele Orte in der Welt, wo die Bundesrepublik in auch UN-Missionen beteiligt ist. Darüber hinaus gibt es ein großes ziviles Engagement Deutschlands in der Konfliktprävention oder in der Postkriegszeit, wo man beim Wiederaufbau wieder engagiert ist. Also Deutschland ist in großem Umfang tätig. Dennoch müssen wir
Nonetheless, we need to have the willingness to do more. So this 2% goal, which we cannot achieve today, tomorrow, or the day after that, but which we committed to, this is something that we need to adhere to. And we need to improve our armed forces in many projects. And I agree with what Ms. Baerbock said. We need to embed this in a European foreign policy, in NATO, but European foreign policy then means when you commit yourself to something together, you need to implement it. And we have this project of a drone developed by Germany and France. So this means that we shouldn't start discussions after the decision whether this and that screw can be delivered for the project. No, this then needs to be done. Now, before we come back to the issue of Mali, which is highly topical, in your party program, you mentioned the 2% goal as arbitrary. There are other commitments from the Federal Republic of Germany for the Eurozone. There are debt ceilings. And do agreements apply for you?
Yes, and the important promise given in the context of NATO is burden sharing. Europeans are to assume more responsibility, and this is what I want. I want to see Europeans assume more responsibility, and this is what is important to the new U.S. administration. Our American friends do not only talk about an abstract 2% goal. The Green Party and high-ranking military officers have stated that we're talking about a goal here that is highly dependent on economic fluctuations. If our economy is not strong, for example, because of a pandemic, our defense spending will increase because GDP is lower. So let's be honest about that. We have to take stock. NATO has just engaged in an extensive review process, and I think that Germany should play an active role here. Mr. Scholz, you have said that you, as finance minister, have increased the budget, and that's right. However, capabilities and equipment for our armed forces have not improved. New helicopters for the Navy, for the military. 1/3 of them is not fit for action, and this is a problem. Mali has been mentioned. We urgently need transport helicopters. They have not been procured. That is why it is so important to me to set clear priorities. A better equipment for the Bundeswehr. We Europeans have to assume more responsibility for our security. I'm thinking of a cyber defense center and swift deployment to Eastern Europe. And we have to pool our forces so that we don't spend 3 times more than Russia. Let me ask you to keep it concise concerning the next question. Let's talk about Mali. The chair of the Bundeswehr Association, Mr. Wüstner, has called for armed drones with a view to Mali. What is the Green Party's position here? We have specified this in our election manifesto, but this has not been made clear. We have made this clear. There are situations in which drones can make sense when it comes to the security of our soldiers. However, other countries have used such drones in a way that is not compliant with international law. Let's go into detail here. This horrific attack, during which many soldiers have been injured, was a suicide attack, as far as we know. Concerning our stance on drones, we believe that we have to take a close look at the specific situation. If members of the armed forces need to be protected, they will need to be protected.
Now, the first thing is we have to purchase them, and then we can discuss the criteria under which Germany uses them. This is the problem that Ms. Baerbock is mentioning, and I think there is a dissent when it comes to purchasing them when you read the program.
There is a difference. We have asked time and again, for what cases do we want to procure such drones? There is not that much money at our disposal. We have to clearly define what situations we are talking about, and we haven't been provided with an answer from the Ministry of Defense here. Let's stay with Mali for a moment. Mr. Scholz, of course, we all find it horrific what happened. What kind of conclusions do you draw from what happened there? Do you think that the operation should continue? Do you think that the SPD wants to see the Bundeswehr leave Mali?
First of all, we have to assess and have a close look at the actual incident. It was, as far as we know at the current point in time, a suicide attack, which you can not really protect against. It is very difficult to do this. You can only do this when you are involved. It is a dangerous mission. I want to stress this, and that's why I talked to the Minister of Defense today to inquire about the health of the servicemen and women, and we can hope that we can guarantee both safety and their treatment, but we have to really do this first. But you are right, when you enter a dangerous mission, as soon as you notice that it is a dangerous mission, you cannot say, no, this is not what we expected. No, in all clarity, we need to say this is a very dangerous mission, even though it's not a big one. And with every decision we take, we need to understand that we are responsible for the lives and the safety of the soldiers. But Mr. Scholz, I'm going to ask the question to all three of you. Don't we run the danger in this limited mission in Mali, which is basically within the framework of the United Nations, a training mission, that we have an uncertainty of the actual goal? This is something that we've done for 20 years in Afghanistan now. So let me repeat my question. If you were Chancellor, would you really assume the responsibility to follow this not very clearly defined training mission during a time where President Macron said to review the combat mission? Would you really want to continue this mission, or don't you have to ask the question as a Chancellor, either we leave because we cannot cope with the risk, we can hardly influence the situation, or we do it in an entirely different way, namely go back in big with the United Nations or the European Union. You're the next Chancellor. What would you say?
Es gibt unterschiedliche Grade von Einsätzen.
There are different types of missions, and indeed this is a training mission. And if this is Germany's contribution within a UN mandate to contribute to training, then it's okay. It doesn't always have to be a combat mission. In other places, it might be that from the word go, we say this might turn into a combat mission. The participation in the Balkans in the 1990s, the right-wing government was responsible for that. From the beginning, the goal was to remove Milosevic and discontinue the ethnic cleansing, and you cannot do this with a training mission, so that's why it was a combat mission. In Mali, we had hoped, in coordination with the partners, to contribute sufficiently with our mission. But if, as you just asked, the strategy changes and France changes its strategy, then we have to closely coordinate and think about what Germany's contribution can be, whether we can step it up or whether it doesn't make sense and we need to withdraw. So you leave the question unanswered. The security situation differs. This mandate, well, first, in Mali, we had the Tuareg, who had split in the north and later were then submerged by Al-Qaeda and later IS and became a danger for Germany and Europe. And during that time, the armed forces said, we want to stabilize the situation in Mali. And over the course of the years, this situation and this assessment can change. So you need to answer in a flexible way. And when our security is threatened in a way that you need to do more, you need to do more.
Concerning Mali, we would like to learn about the stance of our parties. What are the conclusions that the Green Party draws? I think that the question of Mr. Ischinger is really justified. These are difficult decisions in foreign and security policy. There are no all fits one-size solutions. Situations are evolving, and my stance is a bit different than the one of Mr. Laschet. Just to keep waiting and seeing and observing other countries. This is not my stance. We hold a responsibility as a federal government and as a parliament. Parliament approves the deployments of our soldiers abroad. We are the biggest country in the EU, and that is why Germany needs to take a stance concerning deployment abroad. Over the last months, we have made it very clear that the security situation has changed. That is why we have said concerning MINUSMA, we believe that in spite of all problems, we believe that this operation or mission is right. But with regards to training of forces of the forces of dictatorships, we don't think that this is right. So concerning UTM Mali, we don't approve this because this does not take into account the security of our soldiers. We have been criticized harshly by the CDU and CSU. Now President Macron has said something very similar. So it doesn't really make sense for a federal government to not define their stances.
But this is an artificial dissent. You cannot really seriously say, I said we have to always individually judge the situation and see what the German contribution can be. You cannot really seriously contradict that.
I've just said the following. I've said that the situation was wrongly assessed concerning UTM Mali.
Okay, in spite of all of the nice words, what you're saying is let's withdraw.
We are talking about two missions here, and you cannot mix this up. I've talked about UTM Mali, a EU mission, and this also engages in Chad, and I think that this is wrong. With regards to the UN MINUSMA mission, the situation has changed. We saw a coup. That is why I think that concerning UN MINUSMA. This needs to be reassessed if the situation changes. Let's move on to our next section. Let's talk about the EU. Angela Merkel welcomed the French president 1 week ago, and his Minister for European
France and
Affairs has a
Germany
question for
are
you.
key players in Europe. The French-German cooperation remains absolutely crucial to make the EU move forward. We talk more and more about European sovereignty or strategic autonomy. What do you think of these concepts? Are they key priorities on your European agenda?
Ich fange mal mit Ihnen
Now let
an,
me
Herr
start
Scholz. Wenn
with you,
Sie
Mr. Scholz.
sich Ihre Antwort auf diese Frage
When you
überlegen,
think
lege ich noch
about
eins
an
drauf.
answer to this question, let me add a little bit to it.
Hat sich dezidiert erneut
The
nicht zum ersten
SPD
Mal
repeatedly, not for the first time,
ausgesprochen.
decisively spoke out in favor of a European army, which will probably not work if before each and every deployment we have to get the consent of the German parliament. So is there a strategy? Do you have a strategy, an idea how this European armed forces can work with the consent or without the consent of the German parliament? Who is in command? Who decides? Because this needs to be done quickly. Thank you for your question. And if you allow, I would first like to answer the question that was asked by the French minister. I believe it is important to have a clear commitment for the European sovereignty, but this should be more than lofty words where we just feel good. We need to be very precise. So I am in favor of qualified majority decisions in the field of foreign policy instead of 1 or 2 countries being able to stop the European policies. And I think this needs to apply for the area of European foreign policy. And I'm not in favor of small majorities, but qualified majorities. This is something we should agree upon, and this should change the situation. We just had a very in-depth discussion regarding the relationship between the European Union and Russia. There was a Franco-German proposal to talk to the Russian president and also argue and call a spade a spade. This now moved towards a process where we discuss the potential questions that can be discussed if we meet in the first place. And this is a situation that shows that we are not in a very good position because we can't meet. And the American president is meeting Putin and can talk to him. And this is something we should also be able to do. I think it's an important goal. There's one thing that I have in the back of my mind which is really important to me, and that's we will have to insist also vis-à-vis others that they need to negotiate with us as a union, a European Union, vis-à-vis Russia, vis-à-vis the United Kingdom. They didn't like the accreditation of a representative to the European Union. China, the United States, they would like to have the world of the 17th, 18th century back, where you talk to Germany, the United Kingdom, or France. And this needs to change.
Mr. Scholz, how will these majority votes be achieved? Angela Merkel has always wanted them, but this couldn't be pushed through.
Well, this didn't happen in the past. That's why we need to make it a priority now. I said, as an answer to your first question, that I would first travel to Paris because I indeed believe that this is the foundation for this understanding in Europe in matters of foreign policy, but also financial policies. We need qualified majorities, and we need to agree that this happens, and this is something that needs to be done unanimously. But we've just seen that this is possible when I developed developed the concept for the European Reconstruction Fund that Germany, the German Chancellor, and everybody involved in Europe, when I discussed it with them, a lot of people said this needs to be done unanimously. We need to have a ratification process in all of the member parliaments of the European Union. I said, this is so important, it will work. And now I say, this is important and it will work if we sufficiently exert pressure. And I think this is the foundation for us getting security in Europe.
Mr. Laschet, Clement Bohn has just said...
May I just interrupt?
No, you've spoken for a long time.
I just said the second question that was asked will not be answered because I accept that we continue.
That's great.
I didn't want to give the impression that I don't want to answer.
I would like to get an answer from Mr. Laschet concerning Clement Bohn. He talked about strategic European autonomy. If you were Chancellor, would this be a priority of yours, and what would this mean to you?
His question focused on sovereignty, not autonomy, so I would answer yes. To answer his question, I would say yes, that's what we need. And Germany and France is the foundation for this. The Treaty of Aachen, which Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron signed to renew the LEC treaty, is so concrete that there are enough possibilities that a new dynamism can also develop with other European states. This hasn't happened. One of the reasons was Corona for this, but this needs to be the next step. And I agree with Mr. Scholz. This does mean that this is a strength that we need to take into the European Union to achieve majority decisions. In order to do this, we don't need to change the treaties. This is possible based on current European legislation. And in concrete terms, we need to see where we can cooperate beyond the military means. Let me give you an example. Lebanon is about to collapse after the explosion, but also after internal problems. France became involved. Germany supported it, but wasn't overly active in this case. But should the Lebanese state implode, we will be impacted.
And you would like to see a more active German policy there?
Especially in our direct vicinity, the Mediterranean. In the beginning of the new century, we had the European neighborhood policy based on this idea to tie all of our neighbors so closely to Europe with economic, social, rule of law, and other programs to transfer the European acquis to those who cannot become full members, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, whatever they're called. And we need to bring a new dynamism into this process. I believe this would be an ideal task for Europe. We don't have to become active all over the world, but in our immediate vicinity, in our immediate neighborhood, stabilizing the situation there is an important contribution. Mr. Laschet, let me repeat, Clement Bohn mentioned both terms. He said European sovereignty, which you support, and strategic autonomy. But let's not nitpick. I would stay with you for a second and ask the following question. We'll talk about Viktor Orban and the community of values we represent. How would you, as Chancellor, deal with Orban? And let me add to it, if you look at what has happened over the past couple of days, the discussion at the European Council, did the European conservatives leave Orban alone for too long? This is a misunderstanding, Mr. Ischinger. He is and remains one of the 27 heads of state and government. And with the Reconstruction Fund, we needed the vote of Hungary as well. So this answer of let him leave Europe is not an answer. You cannot say this for every argument you have with European member states. There is European legislation, there's the European Court of Justice, and what is happening in Hungary cannot be accepted. And at the end of the day, he needs to accept European laws. The same applies to Poland and other countries where individual cases need to be looked at, but they're still members of the European Union. And European Union does not mean just France and Germany, as much as I love those two countries. We need to find a way of involving the countries of Central and Eastern Europe with different traditions and different history, and we need to bring them back into the European project. And this is cumbersome, and sometimes we need to really use clear words, but we shouldn't fall into the attitude of just pointing the finger at them. Ms. Baerbock is probably not fully in line with you. Can you be brief?
Shall I talk about Hungary or Clement-Bon? Hungary, please. We're talking about those who might not completely share our European values anymore. My opinion is different here. Europe is a community of values. You can read this in the treaties of the EU. Europe is based on rule of law, democracy, equal rights, and other values. Every country joining the EU has to fulfill the so-called European acquis. All laws are looked at, and rightly so, in order to decide whether this country can join this community of values. In the past, and this does not only apply to Hungary, we saw developments with regard to which European values and European rule of law was not abided by. The lesson learned from that was this is not acceptable. We cannot disrespect our own values. Excuse me. The European conservatives, could I please finish my sentence? If the European conservatives had said over the last years that you are a member of the European Conservatives and you don't share our values anymore. If you had said this, would have been a clear stance.
You suspended.
You've just said that this is not a problem of the European Conservatives.
Ms. Baerbock, the question, if you want to become Chancellor, how do you deal with a country that doesn't accept this, is a question that can only be answered by the European Court of Justice.
And I have a different opinion here. And if I could
I'm waiting for your answer.
My sentences. The European Conservatives didn't want to exclude Orban. The European response has been the rule of law mechanism. Firstly, this mechanism was vetoed. Now it was introduced, and now you've ensured that it cannot be fully implemented. To introduce a procedure would be a good idea, and this should also pertain to funds as a way of sanctioning things like that. And now we're talking about the ECJ.
I still haven't heard the answer.
We should implement the rule of law mechanism immediately, and we should stop funds.
Okay, Mr. Scholz, you are sitting there smiling. How?
Scholz, you are smiling. How would you deal with Mr. Orban?
I think I'd use frank words. We cannot forget the difference between member states of the European Union and other states in the world. We created the right for us to also become involved in their internal affairs and discuss those, because we've created this framework. And even though Mr. Orban doesn't like it, I deliberately say it, we are liberal democracies where minorities need to be protected. Nonetheless, we need to know that this is a process that will always be contentious, and you shouldn't shy away from this. This is a process that needs to be pursued, as we are doing it in other unions of states as well. But we need to do this, and we have a lot of citizens on our side. I just talked to the mayor of Budapest and talked to him, who has good chances of becoming the next head of government. And we also created a new instrument that I very much advocated for, namely that when it comes to paying out European funds, issues of the rule of law can be involved. This is what Hungary is speaking out against, is also going to court against, and I'm very much convinced that they won't be successful. And then we can use this as a sword.
This is decisive. If you want to see Europe able to act, and this is what Clement Bon has stressed, if you want this, you have to take action. Now we are talking about the ECJ, so we will postpone this for 2 years' time. If we want to support people like the mayor of Budapest, the EU has to take a clear stance. The German government is a key player and could make it clear to the EU Commission that we need to see sanctions.
But I would really be interested in the answer. How and what would you do? How and what would you do? This entire discussion only works because you don't say the final sentence.
Ms. Baerbock, we have many other questions and we would like to listen to them. So please keep it concise. What would you do if you didn't want to wait for the ruling of the ECJ? A reduction in European funding, because this will hurt.
It's a violation of EU law.
This is possible in the context of the rule of law mechanism. You don't want this. You want to take it to the ECJ. I think we've understood where you stand. So please make a cut here. Let's make a cut here and move on. The world has become more and more complex. Enemies, friends, competitors, partners. Sometimes the bigger picture is broadening. Let's take a closer look at systemic competition, and let's take a look at China. And let's take a question by Timothy Garton Ash.
How does Germany's China policy need to change after the next election to enable a more coherent and effective European China policy, and indeed a more coherent and effective China policy of like-minded democracies around the world?
Also bevor Sie antworten, will ich kurz vorlesen, dass nach einer Umfrage, die gerade in diesen Tagen von der
according to a study carried out by the Korber Foundation, more than 3/4 of the Germans are in favor of supporting additional EU sanctions against China in case of human rights violations, even if that were to be detrimental for commercial and economic interests. So they'd be willing to support sanctions against China. Mr. Laschet, what do you think about this clear and straightforward policy vis-à-vis China? Well, we're competitors of China. We have a different understanding of people. China is an authoritarian system down to the smallest detail. And the difficulty we now have during the Cold War, authoritarian systems weren't economically successful. Now they've become a competitor on the global markets. So I think, on the one hand, we need to really call a spade and point the finger at human rights violations, but in many cases, China is our partner. Now, let me try to ask precise questions here. On Monday, in an interview with the Financial Times, you said the following, and I'd like to quote, "If we always talk loudly and aggressively in public about the human rights situation in China, I'm not sure that this will change the situation." End of quote. Doesn't this sound like shying away? Mr. Ischinger, you've been involved in foreign policy for such a long time. That was exactly what the Cold War was about. We had a clear position, but foreign policy means to jointly define things we have in common with states that don't have anything in common with us. In 1968, tanks of the Soviet Union ended the Prague Spring on the Wenceslas Square, and 2 years later, Willy Brandt started the new policy towards the East. What we should have said is, let's not talk to them anymore, no way, big posters carrying billboards through the streets. No, We did both. We protested and said at the same time, let's look for things we have in common. And the problems that we have in the world can only be solved like that. The climate change cannot be combated without China. If we have to talk, cooperate, be partners, we need to do this. And in a world where you have Russia, the Arab world, Turkey, China, this is the core piece of foreign policy.
Let's stay with China and let's talk about the SPD election manifesto. You want a unified and critical dialogue between Europe and China concerning cooperation and competition. Is this more than mere political rhetoric? What does that mean concerning car parts, for example? And we're talking about human rights violations too.
Well, with the Supply Chain Act, we just passed a very clear law here, which states that this is important for commercial relationships. And I also believe that in our commercial laws, in our trade laws, human rights, labor conditions, and environmental issues need to play a role. It's not about as much free trade as possible. It's also about the situation. And let me put some salt in the wound here. I explicitly am against any kind of decoupling fantasies here. North America, Europe, China, all in their isolation and developing their own economic structures. It is big progress that we have a global economy. It's huge progress that we have international division of labor, and we all create economic affluence based on this. And this was also the big opportunity of the past 3-4 decades, that billions of citizens in Asia, not just in China, had an opportunity for a better life. So what we need is something that brings us back to the basic assumptions of the policies of détente of the 1970s, as executed by Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, and what the West successfully took up. We overcome the division between East and West, and the Iron Curtain disappeared. And I would like to stick to China because we need to, it's always being said we need to do something now and everything will change the day after. The world is,
Mr. Schröder, former Federal Chancellor, said, and this also related to you, Ms. Baerbock, and your approach that the economy or economic matters and human rights should be separated. He said, as a big export nations, we can't challenge our jobs in China. You're of a different opinion here.
That's not my attitude. I think we need clear principles, but we shouldn't notorically build up this hubris as if a decision taken by the German Bundestag would lead to China changing everything from one day to the next. We need to understand that the world is dangerous. There will be a lot of powers that nobody's talking about today in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So we will always have to deal with a situation where we need to find the right balance between our own strength and power. That's why I and so many others talk about European sovereignty. That's why I talk about the community of democracies that President Biden is returning to with his statement, America's Back. And at the same time, this also means by being straightforward and steadfast, we shouldn't fall into the trap of redistributing the world. We are not mentioning the elephant in the room, which is that there is a divergence here, a collision of interests. On the one hand, jobs here in Wolfsburg, Ingolstadt, and elsewhere, and at the same time, a value-based foreign policy we want to pursue. In the Green Party program, there's also a call for more toughness vis-à-vis China. What do you tell the worker in Wolfsburg who is afraid of losing his job?
I believe that we need to pursue a clear approach in foreign policy. You cannot just beat about the bush. You have to confront reality. We need a dialogue and we need to pursue a tough approach. Mr. Laschet, Mr. Scholz, nobody says that we don't have to engage in dialogue with other countries. Of course, we have to talk to China. China is key when it comes to exports and imports, also with a view to jobs in Germany and German prosperity. And the same applies for Russia. However, concerning foreign policy, I believe that you cannot pursue an explicitly economic approach. Sometimes people like to say that human rights are important but are not ready to take commensurate action. Concerning China, and let me come back to Clément Bon, European sovereignty needs to be more than mere rhetoric. We need to define it. And that means, firstly, concerning human rights violations in the context of the Uyghurs, products derived from forced labor, all this is a violation of European and international law. These products must not enter our single market. That is a clear foreign policy stance. Secondly, we cannot only talk about economic matters, because that led to us leaving Hong Kong behind. We should have taken a stance here as Europeans. And thirdly, we need to be clear about values, because that is also in the service of our European industries and jobs. Consider the investment agreement. Some sectors have opportunities here, but China has closed down other sectors. Even the German Association of Industry says that we need dialogue and a tough approach. We need both. We've talked a lot about China now, but the situation is similar with Russia. Let's bring in some more questions, questions by experts and well-known personalities. Concerning Russia, we would like to listen to a question from the European Parliament.
Do you believe President Putin treats Nord Stream as a purely economic project? And would you allow it to be completed if elected?
Das war Radosław Sikorski.
That was Radosław Sikorski.
Ging jetzt schon sehr schnell bog auf Nord Stream ein.
And that was a question about Nord Stream. Mr. Laschet, do you seriously believe that Nord Stream 2 is a mere economic project for President Putin?
President Putin weiß ich nicht.
I don't know whether it is for President Putin, but it is a mere economic project. I mean, at the Munich Security Conference, I said you can't see, when you look at a molecule of gas, whether it's transported by sea or by land. So it's okay that this project is happening and will soon be concluded. And that's part one. Part two, the geostrategic impact is also agreed upon. It should not be to the detriment of Ukraine. There are European commitments, and should President Putin not adhere to these rules and use the leverage against Ukraine, we can always discontinue the project even after the pipeline has been finished.
You've wanted to make a remark concerning Mr. Putin.
I wanted to quote Vladimir Putin, who, during a speech in St. Petersburg 3 weeks ago, said, and I'm quoting from the translation, "The Ukraine has to show goodwill if it continuously wants to stay a transit country for Russian gas." I think this is completely turning his back to the understanding of this being an economic project only. Well, I just said if that's his policy, the project is stopped, because it was the foundation of all of the agreements that Europe signaled to President Putin. And whatever rhetoric he's using in St. Petersburg, he knows what we agreed with Russia.
Does that apply to you too, Mr. Scholz?
I agree. I think Mr. Putin doesn't only have economic ideas. We do. When it comes to this project, it's almost been finished now, and it needs to be clear that we continue what we started, namely to guarantee security for Ukraine. I made the proposal, which the federal government followed, that we commission a special envoy to achieve the extension of the current transit situation so that this doesn't get lost in this plethora of agreements between Germany, Europe, and Russia, etc. And this was successfully implemented by the special envoy from Germany. And secondly, any impact on the gas transit and the security of Ukraine will have an impact on the transit of gas to Germany, and we need to talk about this. And I also talked to representatives of Ukraine who visited me, and it is their idea that we help them to advance a project which is of utmost importance for Germany, namely tapping into hydrogen industry. They are strongly convinced that they can be producers of hydrogen, which will then also be transported through the pipeline that is now transporting gas. And when we talk about these issues in a geostrategic way, we shouldn't leave this aside, that in 2045 we're going to be CO2 neutral, and then gas doesn't play a role at all anymore. Well, you're not Chancellor yet. You're still Minister of Financial Affairs and Vice Chancellor of the government. With her French colleague at the European Council a few hours ago, the Federal Chancellor corrected her course vis-à-vis Russia, this attempt of entering into negotiations with Russia, and she couldn't push through her position. Is this the bill that we now have to pay because Germany lost credibility because of Nord Stream 2? No, it's not. But it is something that we need to take seriously, and I'm very much in favor that the proposal of President Macron and the Federal Chancellor is followed up on. And the first step is the result, or was the result, of the European deliberations, namely that we jointly take stock of what we want to discuss between the European Union and Russia. It's the position of many countries, not only those who are worried about the transit of gas, is that we shouldn't talk to Putin at all. At the moment, it is my opinion that President Biden is right when he says, even if you have a lot of dissent with somebody, you should still talk to him. You need two to tango, and he is there.
America has had power. That is why they can engage in such a dialogue.
But when we talk about European sovereignty, it is also about hard power for Europe, which we believe is a very important issue. But the perspective that we need to develop is we need to include the issues of Ukraine development. So there needs to be a clear policy for the future, and this will change the world. Also, Russia's outlook and Russia's future will be very much impacted by the CO2 neutrality goal. Somebody who only delivers and supplies raw materials needs to ask themselves the question, what about a world which is more based on renewables?
That is why the question is whether it would be in the interest to see green hydrogen transit across Ukraine. But let's turn to Ms. Baerbock.
Just so I don't forget to say this, there's also Ukrainian hydrogen.
In any case, this is not in Russia's interest. Ms. Baerbock, let's not only have you listening to the others talking about Nord Stream 2. The Green Party and you are highly critical of the Nord Stream project. You want to stop this. On which legal basis would you like to do this? From today's point of view, right ahead of its completion, would it not make more sense to do what Mr. Laschet implied, to complete it and then see whether it will be used or not, according to Russia's politics? I believe that we cannot talk about European sovereignty and then shy away in key moments. We cannot just say that this is a mere economic project. I've been looking into this for years. I went to Russia to talk to key actors about their goals. It was said openly that the goal is Ukraine and to circumvent sanctions. Of course, you can try to gloss this over, but this is a fact. Our Eastern European neighbors are highly concerned. The situation has been exacerbated in Ukraine. We've seen the tear garden murder in Germany. A plane was taken down in order to get their hands on a blogger. We cannot just look on. Mr. Ischinger has quoted Putin. Mr. Laschet, you are saying they will abide by the rules, but Mr. Putin is saying we won't do this with regards to Ukraine. We are still dependent on Russian gas. We won't have hydrogen by 2023 that Mr. Laschet is talking about. Once this pipeline is completed, gas will be sent through it. And if Mr. Putin switches off the Ukrainian pipeline, there won't be any more gas there. And his goal is to isolate Ukraine. So imagine a winter in Europe. We won't be able to say, oh, now we don't have any more gas because maybe Nord Stream 2 is switched off too. If you want to lead a country, if you want to assume leadership at a European level, you have to engage in a proactive approach. Mr. Putin is in a competition. He does not only want to destabilize Ukraine, but also us as Europeans. I would not complete this pipeline. There is still one approval that has not been met. I'm talking about unbundling. The operator and the supplier must not be the same. This is not in keeping with European law, so it can be stopped there. And moreover, we can also talk about compensations. However, key actors who have invested in this project have left the project because they have understood that this pipeline doesn't have a future and that it is directed against Europe. Okay, we've understood your position concerning this. We've talked a lot about Ukraine, and I think that this is highly interesting because we will now listen to nobody less than the president of Ukraine himself, President Zelensky.
Dear candidates for the post of the Federal Chancellor of Germany, September 26 will be an important day not only for you, but also for Ukraine. The Bundestag elections matter to us because Germany is our key partner. It is a leading party to the Normandy format and our ally on the way to the European community. Your policy vision for Ukraine as a future federal chancellor is extremely important for me. So let me ask you, do you agree that the European project will not be complete and full-fledged without Ukraine? Do you agree that Ukraine's path to Europe should be a two-way street? 7 years have passed since the Revolution of Dignity, where hundreds of Ukrainians gave their lives for the European choice. Isn't Europe tired of hiding from the question of Ukraine's membership in the EU for so long? Isn't it time to move from diplomatic evasions to clear answers, conditions, steps, and deadlines? Today, about 100,000 Russian military troops are concentrated on Ukraine's state borders. At the same time, all European leaders support Ukraine's appropriate security guarantees. But at the same time, Ukraine is not a NATO member state. So if we are not in NATO, what kind of security guarantees are we talking about? Thank you for your honest answers.
So, President
Zelensky, and by the way, it wasn't easy to get him to ask this question. So let me start with Mr. Scholz. Your opinion regarding this question, EU perspective, NATO perspective of Ukraine, security guarantee, this was a demand that was mentioned, and we'll probably move on to weapons supply and deliveries, which is a green issue. But let's start with that.
Klare Antworten zu der Frage.
Clear answer regarding the question. The European democracies came together in the European Union, and countries that define themselves based on the rule of law, democracy and freedom cannot decide that others will no longer be able to join. But we also need to be fair and realistic. The next tasks that we have in Europe will be to finalize the integration process on the Balkans, to make or to start the process of membership to the European Union, which will take many, many years. And this is the next task facing us. And for Europe, this will be important to not leave anybody behind there in the states of former Yugoslavia and its neighbors. And secondly, I think it is important to continue to reform the European Union. We see how difficult it is to come to decisions with 27 member states. We've talked about giving up the principle of unanimity in certain bodies, and all of this first needs to be done. So I think we need to establish a partnership, a proximity to the European Union for Ukraine. And I'd like to add that I think there is no possibility at the moment to join NATO. If I were Ukrainian, I would say, this is very stale bread. What do you offer? President Zelensky was one of the first to call me when I became chairman of the CDU, because I think Ukraine knows how important it is to see how Germany is positioning itself in this issue. So the process towards democracy, this close connection to Europe in Ukraine, is something that Germany needs to guarantee. What he said in his statement referred to institutional issues, and I think you need to look at the broader picture here. First, membership in the European Union. I mean, you can easily promise this and say, sure, they can become a member, but the reality at the current point in time is different. I remember from when I worked at the European Parliament, those who were against Europe, mostly some British colleagues, were always in favor of making the EU as big as possible, including Ukraine, Russia, Turkey. So a big structure, which at the end of the day would only be a free trade area. But if Europe wants to work, wants to function, the institutions need to be structured in a way that the same law applies everywhere. Here in Berlin, all the way to the east of Ukraine, all the way down to the smallest directive regarding water protection laws. And I do not see this at the moment, that the EU 27 was able to bring in a country as big as Ukraine. That's why I share Mr. Scholz's position. The next task will be to bring the Western Balkans into the EU, which is complicated enough. And then, in theory, there is the outlook for Ukraine as well. But in the foreseeable future, this is not possible.
Before turning to Ms. Baerbock, one follow-up question to you, Mr. Laschet. Mr. Zelensky also said, and these are not mere institutional matters, he asked, what are the security guarantees for Ukraine? What would you answer to him? He asked for honest answers.
With regard to the security of Ukraine, Germany is doing everything to do this. The inclusion in the discussions with President Putin, Macron, Merkel, the Minsk process. Without the involvement, this situation would have probably escalated more, and it didn't in this case. So Ukraine knows in many areas that it has both the institutional and financial support of Germany. If you were Chancellor, this question of weapons deliveries, the Greens differentiate between defensive weapons. Would you be more open than the current federal government, Mr. Laschet? No. Supplying weapons to Ukraine was the first demand. Then we looked at what defensive weapons are, and at the end of the day, we delivered
ambulances. So, I mean, that's an absurd definition of weapons. I think the weapons deliveries in the first place are wrong because our role within the Minsk process and the Normandy format, where Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia jointly agree upon things, that would be discredited because we'd suddenly be party of the conflict.
Mr. Laschet, now, Ms. Baerbock, now Mr. Laschet has asked a question to you. Can you explain what the Green Party means by that? Yes, it is interesting that the CDU and CSU ask so many questions to the Green Party without having answered themselves.
No weapons. Do you have that as well?
I am a bit surprised.
We're talking about
concerning
Ukraine.
Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, you
we're talking about Ukraine, Minsk process, peace in Europe. Ukraine.
You support arms deliveries
Yes,
to other countries, and this is surprising. One thing is clear for us. We hold a responsibility towards Ukraine. Ukraine has abandoned its entire nuclear arsenal, and other countries have guaranteed its security. Then the illegal annexation of Crimea happened, then the invasion in eastern Ukraine followed. There has always been support for the Normandy group on behalf of the Green Party, and we also saw sanctions. However, that didn't change much. Russia kept provoking. Ms. Baerbock, this is a mere description. Yes, let me engage in analysis. Germany has not taken a clear stance. Some CDU members called sanctions in question, and you are in favor of the Nord Stream 2 pipelines, and this has led to puzzlement. With regard to the Minsk agreement, we have to ensure that we do see withdrawal. With regards to arms deliveries, we have specified this. I think that if there are misunderstandings in politics, you need to specify things. And we have to strengthen the OSCE mission. A drone of the OSCE was taken down. There are mines falling down on gardens of families. I think that the least is to provide support in mine clearance so that civilians don't have to die. We've talked about Ukraine, Russia, and China. There are many crisis zones in this world, and there are many expectations concerning Germany. And some countries are particularly important to us, and that is why we will now listen to a question by the former
The Middle East
Israeli
is facing major threats to security and stability, especially from Iran and other terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas. This shadows new opportunities created by normalization between Israel and Arab states, and I hope in the future, peace between Israel and the Palestinians. In light of Germany's important role in strengthening the transatlantic partnership with the US and the special relations with Israel, what specific practical steps should Germany promote to confront the regional security threats and to promote peace between Israel and the Palestinians?
Herr Scholz, wenn ich wieder bei Ihnen anfangen
Mr.
darf.
Scholz, if I may start with you again.
Also im Iran hat sich gerade
In
ein
Iran,
Hardliner
a so-called hardliner has just won the presidential elections,
die Aussichten für das sogenannte
where
JCPOA, also das
the
Nuklearabkommen
outlook for the JCPOA
werden wir sehen. Sie
will
sind sicherlich nicht besser geworden. Wir halten also
get
Deutschland,
worse.
die
We'll
ganze
see. I mean,
Union
it definitely didn't get
fest.
better, but
Wo würden Sie
Germany and the
jetzt
EU continue to bank on it. If you were to become Chancellor, where would you draw the red lines? How far do you go? Also, when you keep the security interests of our partner Israel into consideration, because they are essentially affected. Well, our joint task will be to prevent Iran from developing and using missiles and equipping them with nuclear material that could reach Europe, Israel. So the negotiations on the JCPOA are of utmost importance for the security of the Middle East, Israel, and Europe, and we cannot underestimate it. It's going to be cumbersome, it's going to be difficult, and will become more difficult in light of the elections that happened there. But the fact that it is so difficult and tiring doesn't change the fact that it is a threat for Israel, the Middle East, and Europe, and consequently, we need to stick to it and try to achieve a good result. And we hope that we will have an opportunity to achieve something with the new American administration in spite of the bleak outlook that you cannot gloss over. And the second thing that always needs to be clear, irrespective of what we're doing, Israel can rely on us, and we can ensure Israel's security by clearly stating that we are willing to support Israel's military equipment by exporting arms to Israel. And I've always thought that was correct.
Mr. Laschet, you believe in a dialogue. Federal Chancellor Merkel has never invited the Iranian president in all these years, and this is different from the French. What would your approach look like? Would you follow the French example?
A visit of the Iranian president is not pending. I mean, a hardliner just won in Iran, but President Trump used the harshest means against Iran, discontinued the JCPOA, started sanctions, and the result was zero, nothing. So the hardline also isn't beneficial. And I mean, the hardliner was voted into power after 4 years now. So it is right to try to come back to the process of achieving the agreement, international control of the nuclear program. So these talks are right. And Ms. Livni also asked, what do you want to do as Germany in order to reinstate the process between Israel and the Palestinians? I mean, it would be good if the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves made a few steps to do this, to come back to the Oslo process. Germany alone will not be able to do this. We once had the quartet, European Union, Russia, United States, and United Nations. And coming back to these types of formats requires the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority to show the will to, take some steps towards detente and reconciliation.
The Munich Security Index has analyzed the biggest threats and risks. They've carried out a survey. Among the top 10 or even top 3 risks can be found climate change. These are answers given by Germans. So climate change on place 1, place 2, extreme weather events and forest fires, and number 3 is the destruction of natural habitats. So the top 3 risks are related to climate change and its consequences. It would be easy to ask you now, Ms. Baerbock, because you are nodding, so I'm not asking you the following question, but I would like to ask this question to Mr. Scholz. If you were Chancellor, how would you respond to this kind of risk perception, and what would your foreign climate policy look like?
First, this is very plausible. These are threats that we are facing, so all we can say is the citizens show good judgment here. They see what we will expect in the coming decades. So stopping man-made climate change will have to be one of the important tasks of a future German government, but also at the international level. I made sure that that we will make more funds available to combat climate change. This has been ensured in the run-up to the international agreements. We also need to do this. the people I talked to, the ministers of finance and others, I confronted them with the idea of a climate club, because it won't be enough to do something individually and separately. We need to cooperate, and we cannot, threaten imposing tariffs on each other because we all want to protect our own measures. No, this needs to be a project of cooperation, and it is my impression that this is going to be a huge task which, during Germany's presidency of the G7, should be one of the important challenges. And the third answer, for one of the big aspects of humanity, we need to show the technologies that can be alternatives to gas and coal. And we need to show this here. We need to create the possibilities of using something else than what is being planned in many countries at the moment. Ms. Baerbock, the German public knows that the Greens have defined very far-reaching climate goals. What will you do as Chancellor when you find out that not even in the European Union, not even mentioning the global arena, the big climate violators, when they don't follow suit? How will you persuade others to follow your example?
Firstly, I'd mainstream climate policy at the federal government policy, because climate policy is not only environmental policy, it is also social policy. We're talking about jobs and Germany's economy, and climate policy is also security policy. That is why we would like to establish a Peace and Security Council for the federal government. We would like to see a climate ministry in order to tackle these questions. In 2015, I was at the climate conference. All these topics were talked about then. The EU countries like Germany, that was said back then, should make available a lot of money to contribute that everybody can engage. 190 countries. I'm also talking about small island states. It is not their fault that we are seeing a climate crisis, but they will suffer from it. So we need to think about settlements or protective measures like dams. Secondly, we also need to talk about technology transfer. We need climate partnerships with countries where we can produce hydrogen. And thirdly, we need to continue our path towards the 1.5 degree goal. I've made a proposal here, a pact with industry. We need to see a climate neutral industry. Like this, we will not only protect the climate, but also secure jobs in Europe and Germany.
Mr. Laschet, the competences of the federal chancellor, would a federal chancellor Laschet consider climate policy or climate protection to be so important that it would be the task for the chancellor? Well, it is the biggest challenge. And I mean, what's interesting, you probably asked the citizens, they mentioned the three topics. What are the biggest risks? And we answer them with a foreign policy look.
Because this program is dedicated to foreign policy.
That's okay. That's okay, Ms. Hassler. I mean, when you ask people about what's the most important challenge, they say climate change, man-made destruction, and we rightly say this is a global issue that also has effects on the international community, which is what John Kerry, as the special climate envoy, is doing at the moment. I think we'll need something like this in Europe as well. There's the responsible commissioner, but not equipped with the same power that John Kerry now has from an economic, political, and financial point of view as part of the foreign policy, etc. So this is the one thing we need to do. And the second thing is we need to make our German contribution. Domestically, I mean, some people say it's only 2%, but if we show that we succeed in bringing the strong industry that we have into climate neutrality and steel, chemical, and other industries, automotive industry that 20 years from today is still in Germany but is climate neutral, then this is a huge achievement which doesn't only affect the Minister of Environment.
90 minutes are drawing to a close, but let's stay concrete. So let's confront you with some questions that you please answer by a clear yes or no. Please don't give long explanations. And these are questions to the three of you. I will always start with Mr. Laschet, then Ms. Baerbock, and then Mr. Scholz. Will a government under your leadership do the following by 2025? Will you decide on the procurement of armed drones?
Ich sage ausdrücklich,
I explicitly say my opinion is we already started the Eurodrone.
Ms. Baerbock, by 2025, if it's clear what they will be used for, yes. By 2025, will your government abandon Nord Stream 2?
No.
Yes.
Depends on the development. In general, no.
By 2025, will you reach the 2% goal?
In
our financial plans, we're at above 50 billion, but not 2%.
That's a no. That's the wrong way of measuring it.
We're talking about an additional 19 billion. If facts play a role, it's an additional 19 billion.
You have to accept our answers, but not if they are too long. Mr. Laschet, will you reach the 2% goal by 2025?
Forecast closer, but no.
By 2025, will you support Ukraine militarily?
There are a lot of things involved in this question, but I understand it in a certain way, and I'm saying no. This is not what it's about. The support that we now have with the Minsk process and what we've been doing so far will be continued also with regard to the security of the country, but this is nothing where you have to answer in a funny yes or no.
Okay, I understand that well. Ms. Baerbock, we need to see the withdrawal of Russian troops.
Foreign policy question, answering it with just yes or no, but if everything stays the way it is now, no.
So let's make things a bit easier. Our questions always pertain to foreign policy here. By 2025, will Germany stand up in the EU for qualified majority voting on foreign and security policy questions?
Yes.
And that means that we won't see it by then?
I think it will go very quickly. At the moment, we've achieved a lot with regard to the recovery program unanimously, and we unanimously need to decide that we want to switch over to the majority principle. Then we don't even need to change the treaties.
Yes.
Yes.
By 2025, will you continue arms deliveries to authoritarian regimes in the Middle East? And we're talking about your government. Will this be continued by 2025? We cannot answer this question. There's a difference between Israel and Iran. You cannot mix this up. So let's take Israel out of the equation. Let's talk about authoritarian regimes. Will there be arms deliveries to such regimes? No, because law needs to apply. No arms exports to arms war region. Mr. Scholz?
I think that we will smartly be able to continue the cautious course that we're currently pursuing. We should continue the current path, and we need to individually decide on the situation.
This is our last question. Maybe you need to reflect on it for a while. Let's start with Mr. Laschet. What ability of the two other candidates would you like to have?
That's a good question, right?
Von beiden jetzt oder nur von einem?
Of the two or of just one of them?
No, we're talking about both. If one of you is faster, please go ahead.
Ich habe sie ja zum Teil, die
I
Fähigkeiten.
mean, I have some of the abilities, but what I appreciate, what I like is Mr. Scholz's healthy, good pragmatism when it comes to solving problems. And what I like about Ms. Baerbock is her idealism to want to change things in the world in a courageous way.
Ms. Baerbock, what abilities of the other two candidates would you like to have? I'll join Mr. Laschet. Concerning Mr. Scholz, I very much appreciate that he is so calm, and I appreciate with Mr. Laschet that he is so resilient when it comes to headwind. Mr. Scholz, now you had time to reflect.
Well, as we can give similar answers, I'm going to give a slightly different one. I appreciate about Ms. Baerbock her great commitment, and with Mr. Laschet, the Rhinian character.
Great. I appreciate that you have been here today answering our questions. So let me express my gratitude to you for your readiness to engage in this debate and to answer difficult questions. And surely you will elaborate further on them in other programs.
I can only subscribe to this. I am afraid that we had a couple of issues that we would have liked to discuss with you and that we couldn't for time constraints. I would have really wanted to discuss issues like nuclear participation, armed drones, and other things with all three of you. I would have wanted to go into more detail, but I think over the course of 90 minutes, we've touched many bases from the realm of foreign and security policy and hopefully to be continued.
Thank you.